Seja bem-vindo ao canal Ulisses. Antes de começar o vídeo, deixa like e subscreve no canal. Hoje nós vamos ver uma parte da entrevista do Ivan Van Sertima. O entrevistador é Liverton Miltidon. E também o entrevistador começa perguntando a qualquer pessoa em que ano os africanos vieram para a América. Supostamente as pessoas dirão em 1619. Ele faz pergunta sobre eles vieram antes do Columbus. Ivan Van Sertima responde que há uma distorção muito profunda sobre a história africana. O vídeo está legendado. Este agora é para as pessoas.
Evening. Ask any youngster, or any adult for that matter, when did Africans first come to America? And the answer will be in 1619 as indentured servants. Well, that answer is no longer valid, according to Dr. Ivan Van Sertima, author of They Came Before Columbus. Dr. Van Sertima, an anthropologist and historian, is a graduate of London University and Rutgers Graduate School of Anthropology. He is also a literary critic and has been honored by the Nobel Committee of the Swedish Academy by being asked to nominate candidates for the Nobel Prize in Literature for the past 5 years. Currently, he is Professor of African Studies at Rutgers University. Dr. Van Sertima, up until relatively recently, what had scholars been saying about Africans in the pre-Columbus period in the Americas?
Well, there is a very profound distortion of African history. Almost all of the books that have been written on Africa have been studies of primitives, of people in small communities just barely scratching the soil, people in jungles, etc. There is no appreciation of the fact that after the conquest, or just around the time of the conquest and after, you have a tremendous breaking up of African societies. It's not just a question of tearing these people out of their country, throwing them across the Atlantic as slaves, but the smashing of many things. It's as if you had dropped several hydrogen bombs on Africa. So that what you see afterwards is just the remnants, the ruins of the worst in Africa. The African, therefore, the image of the African ancestor has been built up upon the lowest common denominator. When we go back to European history, European heritage, we always go back to its great heroes, its magnificent achievements. But when we go back into Africa, historians and anthropologists have always looked for the worst. When in fact you begin to study African history seriously, and recent archaeological discoveries have now throwing up remarkable things. They have found within recent years, for example, that the Africans were producing steel in Tanzania, East Africa, 1,500 years before the Europeans. That they had not only entered the age of iron before Europe, but they had jumped into the age of steel. Now what has happened to this? If you go back into Tanzania today, you cannot find this. You cannot find that kind of development. Therefore, you begin to be aware that colonization, the conquest of Europe, didn't drag people up. It actually smashed things that were happening there. Now these things are coming out of the earth because archaeology is beginning to recover these things. African history cannot be recovered, and even American history, early history, cannot be recovered like European history, because Europe has had the advantage after the conquest of having about 5 centuries of fairly settled history. They can go to their libraries, etc., in spite of the wars. But in Africa, the library is in the ground. The record of what has happened, the broken record, lies there. Now they're finding astronomical observatories. 2 years ago, they found that the Africans were involved in the most complex astronomy, that they had plotted a whole star system. This is in Kenya, at Namorotunga. They found among the Dogon in West Africa that Africans had plotted an invisible star 700 years before it was discovered by European astronomers in the 20th century, and that the plotting of the orbit and trajectory of this star, which is a white dwarf, an invisible star, Sirius B, the trajectory and plotting, the plotting of the orbits and trajectories are as accurate as that done by satellites in the 20th century. Recently, yesterday in fact, just before I came here, the New York Times brought out a startling article showing that the Africans had entered the domestication of cattle in East Africa 7,000 years before it occurred anywhere else in the world. And this is one of the bases. This is one of the bases of civilization. So that you have to look again at the African. It is because the capacity of the African, the potential of the African, has been reduced in our imagination and our consciousness by these studies of primitives that we do not realize that the African was involved in things that are just as important, just as significant, and in some areas even more significant than what was happening in Europe before the Industrial Revolution.
Ulisses Santos para Ulisses Santos TV.